Mr. Beat, a YouTuber, a teacher, an educator, a person you'd ideally trust to give you an unbiased centrist TLDR perspective of reality that you know comparatively less about yourself. Think of Veritasium, Vsauce, or Simon Whistler and the tens of channels that he owns, but in politics, and Mr. Beat has, for whatever reason, acquired a reputation of a political neutral persona which posts exclusively educational content on YouTube, but much like Adam Something, he is full of shit.
Surprise!
Forgot the spoilers. Is Mr. Beat really that unbiased and fair as he makes himself out to be, or is he another liberal lunatic not worthy of your attention? Let's explore this question on the example of one particular video that I especially disliked. The video is titled The Great Replacement Theory Explained, and as you would expect if you're familiar with how leftism operates, it will not deal with documenting a statistical decline of the white population in historically white countries, explaining the reasons for it. It will instead first go into misdefining it as something else entirely, and then explaining why it's not happening, before saying that it's a good thing that it does, finishing off with a discussion on how society ought to handle those people who are not particularly fond of this demographic transformation. Now, I originally planned to respond to it after it was first uploaded, but unfortunately I was either too busy or too lazy. Nevertheless, I did promise to Mr. Beat and my followers that I will respond, and so it is better late than never. Even after 2 years. He's watched at least one of my videos before, at least he claims to have watched it, and so I do expect some back and forth after I publish mine, but I still obviously don't expect him to change his mind on anything. This is mostly for the audience, because in my personal engagement with him, he seems to be very close-minded and conspiratorial. As an example, I remember one of my followers were saying to him that the AI can accurately predict one's race, and he was like, but who has created the AI? That's right, racist white people for the purposes of detecting race, while all of the experts agree race isn't even real to begin with, and so obviously DNA can't detect race, and so if the DNA can't predict race, then surely the AI can't either. All of that is utterly false, of course, but as Joseph Goebbels once said, when one lies, one should lie big and stick to it.
I even fell for it, and I'm supposed to be smart.
Enjoy the video.
The Great Replacement Theory says that too much immigration of non-white folks to countries that are mostly made up of white folks is bad.
Well, yes and no. The Great Replacement doesn't necessarily refer to immigration of non-whites per se, but to the decrease of the native white population relative to the increase of the non-white population, who are thus replacing the native white population. Or in even simpler terms,
Great Replacement is the alleged replacement of whites by non-whites.
Now, it doesn't necessarily has to have a negative connotation, for a lot of non-whites and many white liberals openly hail it as a positive development. Let's see some examples.
And the wave still continues. It's not going to stop, nor should we want it to stop. Folks like me who were Caucasian of European descent, for the first time in 2017, will be in an absolute minority in the United States of America. That's not a bad thing. That's a source of our strength.
The white British population has decreased by 600,000, while the minority population has increased by 1.2 million. So, yes, lads, we're winning.
I mean, I remember being in England the first time in the 80s, and it was very different.
Yeah.
Very different.
How so?
Well, first of all, London was like all white.
Yeah. Yep. It was.
You know, so can we just celebrate that victory, that we made a place more diverse and not, you know, you never get a pat on the back.
No.
The people who like achieve, I feel like, in that area. There's only like, there's more to do. Of course there's more to do. But can we just get a little, 2 generations, 3 generations? Okay, that's progress. I'm not a bad person to like clap for progress.
In other words, it only becomes a problem for people like Mr. Beat when it is invoked by the people who aren't happy with this demographic transformation. In other words, you can praise it or even be neutral about it, but the moment you are unhappy about it, suddenly it doesn't exist, and it's a good thing that it does.
Powerful people are trying to prevent whites from having kids. Often the conspiracy is blamed on, you guessed it, Jewish people.
Its origins can be explained using conspiratorial language or academic language, or bypassed entirely in favor of simply focusing on a current description of reality without necessarily delving much into its origins. The Great Replacement could be defined as a perpetual demographic decrease of the native white populations relative to non-whites who are increasingly finding themselves in historically white countries. Much like, for instance, the mass-scale migration of non-whites and Germanics into late-stage Roman Empire before its collapse.
This theory is manipulative because it equates normal patterns of immigration with murder. It's trying to put a big equals sign between the new Salvadoran or Syrian who lives down the street and a mental image of a concentration camp.
Here, Mr. Beat is committing what is known as the equivocation fallacy, in which he originally defines the Great Replacement as the replacement of whites by non-whites, but then goes ahead into debunking its more ridiculous variant that he himself has just invented. So no, the Great Replacement wasn't necessarily planned in a secret room for the purposes of hurting whites. That's a straw man, clearly. Most likely, it happened organically as a result of shifting elite preferences at the top, compounded by a silent consent at the bottom, which originally was not even supposed to result in mass-scale immigration. According to a highly partisan Jewish liberal scholar, Yasha Monk, the reasons for this demographic transformation differ from place to place. In Germany and Switzerland, it was mostly driven by the need of unskilled labor that would fuel those countries' economic miracles in the 1950s and 60s. In France and the United Kingdom, much of it was a consequence of the imposition and later dissolution of brutal empires. In Denmark and Sweden, generous asylum laws played a significant role, but despite the important differences, all these countries share a key commonality. Their transformation is owed to the unforeseen and unintended consequences of policies that had objectively unrelated to the ultimate outcome. None of these countries intentionally chose to turn themselves into diverse democracies, and so none of them ever developed a coherent plan on how to deal with the key challenges they would face as a result. Now, if you look at the 1965 Immigration Act, only 10 years later did it really begin having an effect. Let me quote you a passage from the same Shitley book I quoted earlier, who for whatever reason calls it the Great Experiment. When referring to the 1965 Immigration Act, President Lyndon B. Johnson insisted that this is not a revolutionary bill, it does not affect the lives of millions, it will not reshape the structure of our daily lives. So the Great Experiment is more of a result of mistaken assumptions about the long-term impact of public policy reforms than a testament to a principled commitment to the benefits of diversity, at least originally. Neither Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, nor Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan took a conscious decision to set up the Great Experiment, but now that it's done, moral values have shifted to uphold this dynamic, making it permanent, though as you'd imagine most people are still against it. Of course, you must keep in mind that this is a functionalist interpretation of the origins, for there is no clear consensus on the logic behind this process, but it did become implemented in every single Western country underpinned by the logic of liberalization and management. Anyways, thanks for coming to my crash course history. Now, once that we have defined the Great Replacement the second time, the video could have simply ended right there, but Mr. Beast has decided to make an even grander assertion that he couldn't back up, which is, that's right, you guessed it again, it's not happening.
Only are those who preach about the Great Replacement theory manipulating us, but as it turns out, the entire theory is bullcrap. It's, literally not backed by evidence at all.
It's like literally not backed by evidence like at all. Chief, we didn't come here to replace you, okay? What you're protesting against doesn't even exist. And now back to the video, in which Mr. Beast presents with 6 arguments, or perhaps should I say assertions, as to why the great replacement is not happening and why it's a hacking great thing that it does. For the sake of saving time, the claims are presented in front of your screen. Now, the nature of these claims is that they come in a sequence, in a manner in which every subsequent premise contradicts the previous, while also assuming that you have not accepted the preceding series of arguments, which is presumably why you need to hear another one. Not a particularly great way to convince people, but most Soyem ate it anyways, so it's not like Mr. Beat failed in his mission. At any rate, I'll be going through dismantling these 6 arguments in order, even though they pretty much dismantle each other when they are grouped together in a sequence. Claim number 1. There are more whites than ever before.
Well, they must be doing a pretty poor job, eh? Since there are more white folks now than ever before. You might be thinking, well, duh, Mr. Beat.
First of all, even if we go by absolute numbers, the white birth rate isn't high enough to sustain the overall white population in the world. For instance, over the last 10 years, the white population of the United States has decreased by 20 million. In the UK, the white British population has decreased by 1 million, but of course, this doesn't matter as much as the relative number of natives to foreigners. Let's look at Israel as an example. The Christian population there is growing. It was 40,000 in 1950 and almost 200,000 now. You could say they're thriving, except for the fact that at its founding, the Christian population of Israel has amounted to around 10% of the total, and now it's less than 2% of the total. In other words, as the overall percentage of the population, their numbers and influence has fallen by a whopping 80%. Whites in the West will simply face the same future. So no, in a fantastic scenario in which by some miracle the UK's white population grows to a 60 million or even 65 million, the fact of the matter is that it will also house an entire country of Pakistan, and thus it will turn into a Pakistani state. Claim number 2. You aren't actually being replaced because race is a social construct.
There are more white folks now than ever before. You might be thinking, well, duh, Mr. Beat, but whites represent a smaller percentage of the proportion of the world. Well, who counts as white isn't based on genetics or even demographics. It's based on politics. In the United States, for example, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and Polish Americans weren't considered white until the early 1900s. Greek Americans weren't white until just a few decades ago. Some Arab Americans used to be considered white, but by the end of the 1900s were no longer considered white.
In other words, well, actually, you're getting replaced by you. You see this Indian man and this Haitian right here? They're actually white, just like you are. Problem solved, bucko. He invokes Noel Ignatiev's ghost, by which the historic discrimination against Polish, Jewish, Italian and Irish whites by Anglo-Saxon Protestants became equated into the discrimination of non-whites by whites, because according to Noel Ignatiev, discrimination goes only one way, from whites to non-whites, and thus whoever happens to be on the receiving end of the discrimination is automatically non-white. Well, if Poles or the Irish or whoever else weren't white to begin with, why were they allowed into the country in the first place? How come they received citizenship given that the United States Congress' first act was to limit naturalization to any free white persons? How come they weren't subject to slavery, Jim Crow and zoning laws? But at the end of the day, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are but a fraction of the white demographics in America and the globe. If you go to France, Brazil or Russia, the same racial reality will remain, but without the wasps.
Even though race isn't a biological reality,
if race isn't biological, then why can't a black family give birth to an Asian child? And how come can I send my DNA to a genetic ancestry company and see my results? Now, I actually brought this same question to him on Twitter, and he said that it's not possible. So, whoever sent their DNA to an ancestry testing company, sorry guys, but it's just not possible.
Why isn't it possible? It's just not. Why not, you stupid bastard?
For whatever reason, in our mainstream conception, race is imagined to be equated to skin pigmentation. By the way, you should watch this older video of mine, but the truth is that over 80% of the gene is expressed in the brain. If race was truly about skin color, then we surely would consider Northern Asians white and Dravidian Indians black, yet we don't. Why? Well, for the same reason the Greater Swiss Mountain Dog and Rottweiler aren't considered the same dog breeds. Yes, they look kind of alike and they have the same fur texture, but other underlying differences that stem from genetic ancestry make them different subspecies.
Camus particularly was afraid of Muslim immigration, arguing they often had a much higher birth rate than whites, even though around 40% of Muslims identify as, white.
Here we are again confusing biology with identity. I suppose for a person who believes that biological sex plays no role in gender, this argument looks convincing, but at the end of the day, with the exception of Bosnians, Albanians, and some converts to Islam, those brown people who identify as white identify so on census only because there is no Middle Eastern and Northern African category.
Dillingham, do I look white to you?
Congresswoman, I think that if you tell me what you identify with, and I think I would respect that.
Sure. So, Dr. Director, are you aware that people like me who are Arab, Middle Eastern, North African have to indicate that they're white on the U.S. Census?
Furthermore, if one can identify as white despite not being white biologically, can one also identify as another race while being born inside the body of the assigned race? Of course, we will never get the answer to that question.
Not only that, immigration is simply currently not high enough, nor will it likely ever be, to make it so that skin color, values, or culture will completely change in one country.
Claim number 3. The people who are replacing you are not coming in sufficient numbers to replace you in such a way that it would be immediately noticed. Well, the easiest proof of the falsity of this statement is by referring to official immigration statistics. If you take any Western country and start counting from the year 1960, you would see a clear demographic transformation in which by year 2060, all of the Anglosphere nations, without exception, will become majority non-white. Furthermore, according to present dynamics, this shift will occur much faster than previously anticipated. For instance, Canada, with a population of less than 40 million people, has received 1.3 million people in the year 2022, as a result pushing house prices up, which I guess would be noticeable enough for Mr. Beat. Same thing as in the UK, by the way, and of course the source of these migrants are in 75 to 80% of the cases happens to be from outside of the Western world, so not only will they drive up the house prices and ruin your social services, but they'll also change the cultural landscape of your country.
Sure, there will be demographic changes, and there already has been, but there is no evidence that these recent demographic changes have dramatically changed the dominant culture and values of any one country. We often just see cultural assimilation. Oh, cultural assimilation is the process in which a minority culture gets absorbed into the dominant culture of a society.
Claim number 4. The people replacing you don't possess a culture, so they will assimilate to yours. It assumes that immigrants don't possess a culture, or it is not strong enough, and therefore they'll just end up like bland white people. Well then please explain to me why haven't blacks successfully assimilated into the dominant culture of society after hundreds of years, or better explain to me why Jews have created such strong cultural pressures that much of our society has in many ways adapted to a culture significantly shaped by them. You see, immigrants aren't a blank slate. They come with their own internal baggages that will manifest themselves in their nation of destination. In his book, The Cultural Transplant, Garrett Jones estimates that approximately half of the cultural attitudes of second generation and subsequent immigrants are carried over from their homeland to manifest in their new country of residence. However, while these reflect cultural attitudes, biological predispositions are far more significant, causing an average immigrant to nearly mirror the characteristics of their homeland. Assertions number 5 and 6. The culture of the people replacing you is almost always beneficial to you, and culture is constantly changing, and we've always been multicultural anyways.
Not that that matters, as these immigrants already share American values. That's why they're coming here. And the different cultures they bring are almost always beneficial to American society.
Almost.
Also, most immigrants, and especially their children, assimilate peacefully into the existing culture, which, by the way, is constantly changing anyway, and has always been multicultural.
I lumped the last two arguments together because in argument 6 he eventually gives up, throws in the towel and says, yeah, immigrants will come to replace you and that's a good thing. Okay, we knew that from the start. Now, if we apply this logic to other worldly scenarios, then clearly you could argue that Native Americans and Arabs in Palestine have objectively benefited from white colonization, given that their replacement was done by people who were way more techno-economically and socially ahead of them. But at the same time, he recorded this little video complaining about the cultural genocide of Native Americans by whites trying to assimilate them into their society. So how come one group takes over another and orders it to conform to its cultural assumptions a form of a cultural genocide in one place and an enriching experience in another? Native people in all known historic cases get oppressed by those who come to replace them. The Japanese in Hokkaido, the Manchus in China, the Vikings, or more recently, for instance, the Latvian population was almost made into a minority in their historic homeland, and culturally speaking, they were pretty much almost Russified. But if we go back to the argument number 1 and look at the graph, the ethnic Latvian population grew by 100,000 since the times of the Soviet occupation, so I suppose there was no instance of replacement, because after all the Latvian population grew until Latvia got its independence, after which it began to fall. That is to say, they should have been annexed by Russia again to experience a new wave of cultural enrichment. By the way, that's an actual argument in certain pro-Soviet circles, but I digress. The point is that minorities can take over majority countries and make them run for them. We already know the examples of South Africa, but consider the example of Chinese in Malaysia, who, despite representing just 22% of the population, virtually run the entire economy and government. And as you would expect, this causes a lot of tensions, and not just in Malaysia, but pretty much everywhere where there are Chinese in Asia. Let's assume that the replacing force is generally better than you, as in the case with Asian immigrants into the West or Ashkenazi Jews in the historic lands of Palestine. Now, Israeli Arabs clearly experience better healthcare, education, standard of living, and property rights than they would experience without the Jews settling in. But can you really say the same with regards to their culture and a sense of nationhood? Can you really say that they aren't being terrorized by the majority population? Let alone, can you say that the Palestinian diaspora, which is now living outside of Israel proper and Palestine, benefited from Jewish migration into Israel? Certainly not. But in our particular circumstance, most of the people coming over can't even get their life together, let alone take an entire country. These aren't Ashkenazi Jews or Northeast Asians. They're generally less productive than natives or the average population, and what they'll bring is more social tension, a collapse of trust and of the welfare system, which will set us back to a more authoritarian past. To quote a shit-lib political philosopher Yasha Monk, the history of countries from India to Indonesia shows that diversity significantly increases the danger of violent conflict. The citizens of the world's most celebrated democracies have prided themselves on their ethnic purity. From Athens to Rome and from Venice to Geneva, pre-modern attempts at self-government were restricted to an ethnic in-group. Meanwhile, the most celebrated examples of diverse societies were, with very few exceptions, empires or monarchies. From Baghdad in the 9th century to Vienna in the 19th century, episodes in which a great variety of different groups lived together peacefully and influenced one another's cultures came at times when the people had little say over their collective fate.
assimilate peacefully into the existing culture, which, by the way, is constantly changing anyway, and has always been multicultural.
Now that Mr. Beat has admitted that culture does change when you mix elements from different cultures together, before weirdly claiming that our society has always been multicultural, which I mean is not even true, especially in the context in which multicultural is equated to multiracial, for I don't think around 100% ethnically white countries with a strong patriarchal tilt could be considered as multicultural, but okay, another L I guess, let's move on.
By the way, I'm not that smart. I just pretend to be smart on YouTube.
In the next section of the video, he starts by deliberately mispronouncing Lauren Southern's name and labeling her a white supremacist in a desperate attempt at suppressing her ideas from being further proliferated, before linking concerns about your own demographic integrity with terrorism.
2017 video by, what was her name? Northern? Warren Northern? Yeah, I think that was it. Well, the video has since been taken down, but still, back in 2017 it did very well, and just Warren casually bringing up the theory like it ain't no thing was surprising. Congress, Steve King of Iowa, endorsed the theory. The scariest thing about this being so mainstream is that it has led to violence.
There isn't an argument to be had here, I'm simply pointing out what a slimy person Mr. Beat is. He then proceeds to dissect white nationalists, which I'll also skip, and instead debunk Mr. Beat's debunking of white nationalist talking points, or lack thereof.
Biology is destiny. It's manipulative because when we hear biology, we think, oh, it's science, so it has to be legit, right? This one says that culture is genetically determined and that genetic features predetermine cultural traits. For example, they might say that all of the problems in the African American community and in all of Africa are rooted in inferior genetics or culture. In other words, they say that black people inherently are less intelligent or more likely to be violent. It's bullcrap. It's been disproven by decades of scholarly research.
It's been disproven.
For example, many outcomes, from measures of intelligence to violence, are driven by socioeconomic status and income inequality. There is absolutely no evidence that biology is the driving factor.
Now, where's the study? Because I could pull out a bunch saying that poverty has no causal relation to crime, and why would it, since the richest black people commit more crime than the poorest Asians?
For example, African Americans perform similarly to other Americans when given access to the same opportunities.
Okay, this is just straight up false, and he won't even show the study, so I don't even know how to work with this.
Talking point number 2. We are brave to speak the truth, and the normies are cowards.
I'm skipping this too, by the way.
Diversity is conflict. It's manipulative because the vast majority of us fear conflict. And this one says that diversity automatically causes conflict. It often relies on cherry-picking evidence and studies to back up its claim. It's bullcrap.
I mean, it's the most predictive variable for conflict, both within and between nations. Not even Yasha Mong disagrees with this. This is basically a common accepted fact for anyone outside of the radical liberal bubble.
It's bullcrap. There is plenty of research that actually shows that diversity enriches societies, even in the ways the haters claim to care about. For example, diverse groups of problem solvers often outperform groups of high performers on really tough problems. And that makes sense because tough problems need new perspectives. It's how we got automatic elevator doors, basketball, and the iPhone.
Correct. But it deals with a diversity of skill, not diversity of race, with their own innate biological predispositions, abilities, cultures, and group affinities being placed together in a room. Like, are you seriously trying to tell me that a team of programmers working on a video game, each specializing in diverse tasks using multiple working strategies, is the same thing as placing the entirety of Congo in your neighborhood?
That's right. That thing you're watching watching this video on right now wouldn't exist without diversity.
Yeah, obviously. Now show me some Black and Filipino inventions so we could better understand the benefits of diversity. Well, thankfully, there's data on patents, and as it turns out, Black inventors' patent rate is 6 per million, while the average national rate is 235 patents per million. Pretty tough. But again, it's not racism. Whites aren't at the top here, Asians are. And perhaps Asians should share their privileges with blacks so people like Mr. Beat won't get offended.
They argue that it's natural for humans to act in the interest of their own race, even at the expense of others outside of their group. It's bullcrap. Remember, powerful people created the whole idea of race in order to divide us and to justify their place at the top of social hierarchy.
What? Seriously? Are we now going to deny tribalism? I'm sorry, but even non-genetic social identity theory would disagree with you. He then goes on to talk about mysterious powerful people who supposedly have invented the idea of race in order to divide society. But this is sort of our point. Why else would the elites transform a homogeneous society defined by one race of people into a multiracial society with low trust in which people would not form into unions, clubs, and engage in other collective-based bargaining? Also, I'm not necessarily claiming that powerful people want to divide people by race, but they certainly wouldn't be able to do so if they weren't already divided by race. So why continue further fracturing our society so that it could be further divided by powerful people? This is entirely self-defeating on your part, Mr. B.
Also, how exactly are whites being exploited?
Well, that's pretty easy.
Pull that shit up, Jamie.
This is manipulative because it points to a vague threat to make you feel scared, yet doesn't provide good evidence of specific exploitation of whites.
Besides our trust and social safety nets collapsing as a result of diversity, we provide non-whites or brown people with a ready infrastructure that their ancestors haven't built, in addition to large sums of welfare that they disproportionately receive and not give back. But this is sort of an economical argument. The reality of the situation is that things are way worse at these symbolic and institutional levels, for they are encouraged to self-organize at our expense and bully us for more benefits like DEI or other systemically racist preferences in which they acquire positions not because of merit but because of their race, while we are denied to act in the same way. I'm not even speaking of the amount of emotional trauma through which whites go through every day as a result of people like Mr. Beat. Because before replacement migration, nobody thought about race, microaggressions, and similar stuff. People just lived their normal lives, but now whites are forced to walk on eggshells every day, and I doubt that this is what we would choose to go through if we were given a choice. The final section of the video contains the Great Replacement red flags, on which I'll just end the video, because it already assumes you agree with him anyways. So thanks for watching, stay tuned for more, and subscribe to my Substack, by the way.
But anyone, including me and you, can fall for Great Replacement Theory messaging since they use manipulative tactics to make false claims sound plausible. And if we're not careful and critical, we can be manipulated, and heck, we could even be radicalized by this stuff.